you. Let's go to our Bibles, Esther chapter 8 and 9. I'm going to use some of the early slides to introduce the lesson tonight and just do a review. And hopefully none of this is going to be new to you. You're going to say, oh, I've heard this. And so just a review of really 5 characters that we find in the Book of Esther, and I've shared those with you. We open up with King Ahasuerus. After him will be his son. Anybody know the son of Ahasuerus? Artaxerxes, right? Ahasuerus, his other name that he goes by in history is Xerxes the First. He will have a son, Artaxerxes, and he is the son of Vashti. And as you can see up here, Vashti is the queen mother in Esther chapter 1. And then we have Esther. Her name means star. Hadassah, her name means fragrance. Mordecai, he's known in the scripture as that Jewish man. That's what Ahasuerus is, Mordecai the Jew. And that's how he's known in the book of Esther. And then finally you come to Haman, an evil political official. And Sunday morning was kind of interesting, wasn't it, when I told you about booing? Somebody decided they would boo, and so it is. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So let me just go through the quick review. Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's commandment, and some books have this painting as Queen Esther. It really isn't. The original painter listed the subject as Queen Vashti, so that's who she is. So she refused to come to the king. Somebody tell me, what happened after she refused to come to the king? What did the counselors tell him he had to do? Get her out of here. Why? Because all the other women of the land, they're going to rise up and they're going to be like Queen Vashti, and we can't have that. So enough of that. And then we come to Esther, and this one is the original painter painted her as Queen Vashti, and of course she's the Jewish maiden. Anybody remember how many Josephus said were vying to be the queen? 400, very good. 400 were vying to be the queen. So just think about a palace room big enough for housing 400 women, all wanting to be the queen, right? And then Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, because her father and mother had died when she was younger, and he adopted her, took her for his daughter. And then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. He overheard a plot of 2 chamberlains to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And you might remember he told Esther, who told the king that there is a plot to kill you, O king. And Esther, notice verse 22, certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And you'll see, well, we saw Sunday, that in the Chronicle of the King, it was written that Mordecai had interceded and saved his life. And of course for Haman, that was bad news, all right? Esther chapter 3, these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman. Haman, being a wicked man, advanced him. The position there, probably we would liken it to being prime minister. So he is second to the king. And Haman, of course, we know was a wicked man. Mordecai, though, was a man of conviction, and he refused to bow to the wicked, and of course refused to bow to Haman. Well, Haman gets all upset. He ends up going to the king. He tells the king that there are people that are living in your kingdom. They have their own laws, they have their own commandments, and they are your enemy. And so he talked Ahasuerus into signing an edict that 11 months later would mean the slaying, the genocide of all the Jews. Well, Mordecai finds out about the edict. He comes to the gate of the city, and there he is and rent his clothes, puts on sackcloth with ashes, and then he was crying with a loud and bitter cry. Anybody remember what did Esther do when she found out her adopted father, was sitting at the gate? Sent him a change of clothes, right? Well, we'll fix that problem. We'll just, get dressed, Mordecai. You can't come to the gate like that. And so he refused the clothes. And so he sent back word that of the edict and sent a copy of the edict. And in Esther chapter 4, he tells his daughter Esther that the future of our people lies with you. And so Esther responds to that. Now here's another question. If Esther had refused to intercede to the king, with the king, what did Mordecai say would happen? The Lord would turn to another, but her family would what? Would perish. So very direct with her. And so she finally accepts the challenge of going to the king. Anybody remember why she says here in this statement, if I perish, I perish? Right. The law of the Medes and the Persians. You don't approach the king unless you have been invited, bidden. And so she goes, she stands outside the throne room knowing that it may be that she could lose her life. So in that act, she was putting her whole faith in the future of her people and God sparing her life. Esther 5 verse 1 then, Esther put on her apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house. And of course, now I'm jumping way ahead now, so I'm going to jump ahead. There were, how many banquets did Esther, she hosted 2, all right? So the first banquet, she invites Haman, right? Haman, that wicked Haman, and they come to the banquet. And Haman is just kind of rejoicing. He and the king have had wine and dinner with Esther the queen. And so it was a big deal. All of his family knew that he was having lunch or dinner with the queen. But as he's leaving and his heart is rejoicing, he's going out the gate, and Haman saw who? Mordecai in the king's gate. And Mordecai, he stood not up. And so here he had been privileged, and yet he was full of indignation. And so then we come to Esther 5 and verse 14. He goes home and he tells his wife and his friends about Mordecai. And they said, well, here's what you could do. Let's just get rid of Mordecai. Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. How high is that? 75 feet. Man, you guys would ace me today. All right, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou merrily with the king unto the banquet. And it pleased Haman. And then we come, while that night is passing, we remember that the king couldn't sleep, right? On that night, the king could not sleep, commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And, of course, the king hears about how Mordecai had intervened, saved his life from assassination, and the king is pondering, now what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai? And people said, the servants all says, nothing's been done for him. And so while he's pondering that, guess who comes in? Haman. The king actually says, who's in the outer court? And they say, well, Haman's in the outer court. Bring him in. And so the king then is asking Haman, what should be done for a great man, a man in whom the king desires to honor? And Haman thought the king was wanting to honor whom? Himself. So he really put it out, king, give him your robes, give him your crown, put him on your horse, and then have one of the leaders of your government lead him through the streets and saying, and thus shall it be to any man in whom the king delights. So I have to laugh. Every time I think about that, I just wonder the irony of that moment for poor Haman. I will say poor Haman, but you can imagine his world turned upside down in a moment. Well, so the king and Haman then came to the banquet. Remember, he went home, he told his wife that what had happened that day, and his wife said what? You're going to die. You're in big trouble. Mordecai the Jew has got the upper hand on you. You're in big trouble. And about that time, the servants show up from the king, and they say it's time to go to the banquet again. And so he goes back to the banquet, and the king looks at his wife and he says, "What is it that you want?" And that's when it really starts to go bad. And so Esther says, "O king, if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." In other words, save my life. So the king he's taken back, save her life. Why would you ask that? And then he says in verse 4, "We're sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish." And then she says, "If we had been sold as slaves, I wouldn't complain. I would have held my tongue." Although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage, the damage that the king does by his edict. And therefore, the king Ahasuerus answered and he said unto Esther the queen, "Who is he and where is he?" He that durst pressure in his heart to do so. I presume, rather. And verse 6, and Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman." And can you imagine sitting there at the table? Or lounging on the couch, which might have been the case. And she points across the room and she says, "Thou art the man," right? And so the king gets up. He goes outside. He's furious. He comes back in. He finds Haman kneeling at the feet of Esther, and he accuses Haman of attacking his wife, of almost trying to seduce his wife. And of course, he's determined to do something with with Haman. And the servants make a suggestion. And what is it? Haman's already built a gallows out at his house. Why don't you just hang him on it? So the king says, "Yeah, you're the first one, Haman. Give it a swing." And so he does. All right. Now, that brings me to... Let's go to Esther chapter 8. That's enough of that review there. I wanted to go over it because it's one of those things I might not ever have that opportunity of preaching it again. And so let's go through this. So we are now at the point Haman's swinging in his yard, and we come back, and here is the king and Esther, and then Mordecai is sent for. So let's follow this. Let's go through this. So we've got the elevation of Mordecai. And on that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. So the estate of Haman, who, by the way, is a very wealthy man, we've already seen that earlier, gives him the estate of Haman. Gives Haman's estate to Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. First time the revelation that Mordecai the Jew is my father. That's the first time. Now before that, she's already identified with the Jews. Verse 2, and the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman. Now, you don't see that earlier, but he had given Haman a ring. What was the importance of the king's ring? Right, it was like a signet. He could press it into wax, and it was a seal. And so it's a authority that he gives him, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So all of a sudden, Mordecai is now over a very large estate. So you see that elevation and just how swiftly it takes place. And then an edict that empowered the Jews to defend themselves. Now, there was still a problem, and that problem was what? The king had signed an edict, and that edict said that 11 months later, all the Jews would be slain, and all of their goods would be taken as spoils by the people. That edict has gone out. And so there's a problem. What's the king to do? Well, Esther is going to appeal, rescind your edict. But he couldn't. Why? Do you remember? Right. The king could never, a king of Persia could never alter his own edict. When he had stated it, it was done. There was nothing he could do. He could not even remove his own edict because of the absolute authority of it. And so let me take you through some of this here. I know I'm kind of gliding through it a little bit, but let me get to the book of Esther myself. And I'm going to invite you, and we're in chapter 8. Let's go through this a little bit. All right, chapter 8, let's pick it up at verse 3. It's not going to be on the PowerPoint. Esther chapter 8 and verse 3. And Esther spake yet again before the king, that fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. That's the decree that all the Jews are to be killed. And so here we have the queen in tears begging the king to rescind the edict. Verse 4, but the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I found favor in his sight, the things seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure, literally, how can I bear to see the evil that shall come into my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? But then the king is going to acknowledge not only the edict, but that he can't rescind it. Verse 7. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther, the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. Him they have hanged upon the gallows because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Then we come to verse 3. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name. Seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. So the king says, I can't rescind my earlier edict, but you, Esther and Mordecai, you write another edict, take my ring, seal it. And so what are they going to do? And the answer is they're going to counter the king's edict. They can't rescind it. So now they're going to empower the Jews to actually fight against those that would seek to cause them harm. Let's pick it up, verse 9 then. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, and that is the month of Sivan, I think it is, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews. So you see how much power already that Mordecai has. Then you can see where it's sent out to all the different provinces. Anybody remember how many provinces there are in Persia? 127. Man, I'm going to let you teach this next time. There we go. Let's keep going. All right. Verse 10. And he wrote in the king, and this is on the PowerPoint, and he wrote in the king Ahasuerus his name, sealed it with the king's ring, sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. Anybody know what that is? It's a one-hump camel, all right? Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and prophets that would assault them, both the little ones and women, to take the spoil of them for a prey. Now, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to jump down a little bit and invite you to look with me at verse 14. And so the posts, that is the couriers that rode upon mules and camels, went out, and they hastened, and they pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad, and the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. Many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, did they convert? Can't say that. But maybe a good pretend would have helped, right? So you've got the two competing edicts. One says kill all the Jews. The other now says to all the Jews, you can kill anyone that attacks you. So we've got both of those edicts that are taking place. Now I'm going to take you back up to verse 17 and invite you again. Look at verse 17 before we go to chapter 9. And in every province and every city, whithersoever the king's commandment, his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, and a feast and a good day. That brings me to the feast of Purim. Now, it's pronounced in different ways, so you may disagree with my pronunciation of it. But this is a feast that the Jews still observe to this day. It is not a Bible feast one of the major feasts of the Old Testament. But it is a feast that was institutionalized at this time in the Scriptures by Esther. And so let me take you through a little bit of that. So we're talking about a feast that the Jewish people to this day still celebrate. So let's pick up Esther chapter 9, and this I'll get to this in a moment. But I want to draw your attention to verse 1 of chapter 9. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, that is, overpower them, though it was turned to the contrary, the Jews had rule over them that hated them. So we've got this major clash now, providentially, that is going to happen. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear or the terror of them fell upon all the people. The rulers of the provinces, the lieutenants, the deputies, officers of the kings helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Why is that? Because Mordecai is second only to the king now. So there's a fear of Mordecai in the palace itself. Now, verse 4, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. He's becoming more and more powerful. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter, and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And so you really see the tide has, so to speak, turned. Now, there's some other things that are given here. Verse 6, 500 men were slain in the palace, apparently coming to the palace, and 500 died there. You can look in verse 10. 10 sons of Haman ended up themselves being slain, really slain ultimately on the gallows that their father built. But notice in the last part of verse 10, the sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. That's interesting. So they didn't plunder the people. It could not be said that the Jews were slaying their enemies because they wanted to enrich themselves. The king's edict had said they had the authority to take those who tried to slay them and take their spoils. But here we read that they did not do so. Where are we? Let's go to verse 15. The Jews that were in Shushan then gathered themselves together on the 14th day, also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. I'm going to jump down a little bit in this study here. So, the Jewish victory and celebration goes all the way to verse 16, but then there's the commemoration of redemption and the feast days of Purim. Now, those are still celebrated today. Give you a little bit of what happens on that day. It's been perverted, but generally for the Jewish people that are sincere in their celebration, they will dress up their little girls like Queen Esther. They'll actually put on them gowns. They'll put on maybe a gold crown. And they teach their daughters the elegance, the faith, the courage of Esther. So Esther, for the Jewish people, is a role model. And then it's been perverted, though, and I don't want you to take time to do it here, but sadly, there are some now that have turned it into almost like a clown festival. If you research this a little bit later, you'll bring up images of people like clowns. I mean, literally red noses and clowns and all, and they've just really perverted it. And I would remind you, that's true in our culture, too, when it comes to some of our holidays, that they've been perverted. They've been turned into something that they are not, you know. And I'm not going to go down that road because invariably I might upset somebody. But you think about what we would call holidays celebrated by believers, and you can almost, with every one of them, guarantee yourself there's a perversion of that, and that's true here. But that's where this thought of with Haman, boo, and I wanted to give you the exact words in how those young people address it. See if I can find it here. Let me go a little bit further with this thought here then. I'm going to go, here we are. Now, the Feast of Purim memorializes God's sovereignty and loving care of his people. So here's, rather than boo, here is basically what the Jewish synagogue would say. Every time this story of Esther is always read on this feast day. And when it is read, every time they hear the word Haman, they'll say, may his name be accursed, or may his name be erased. The Jewish people simply do not want to mention the name of Haman. It would be kind of like Hitler, the Jewish people and the affliction of the Holocaust on the Jewish people and Hitler. And the amazing thing is that they've been calling Trump Hitler for 8 years now or something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Another thing that they'll teach the Jewish children to do is they'll write Haman's name on the bottom of their shoe. And then
Haman's name.
stomp him out. And even like during their teachings, all the people in the crowd, when they say Haman, will start stomping their feet.
Right. Did you hear what she said? That they'll write Haman on the soles of their shoes, and every time they hear the name Haman, they'll stomp him. So I'm going to come back. You think about that for a moment, because I want to come back and I want to ask you, what are they trying to teach their daughters and their sons? We'll come back to that. So let me wrap this up. Esther 9:29, Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. Now this is where they institute this holiday, this festival, this feast, and it's still celebrated to this day. And you could read through that. I want to wrap up because I know choir's coming. Let me go to Esther 10, and then we're going to come back to what I was just talking about. Let's deal with the character and attributes of men the Lord calls. First is this: Esther is the heroine of the Book of Esther. She is the heroine. But I would suggest to you the real hero is Mordecai and his influence in his daughter's life. It's amazing to me to watch her confidence, her trust in Mordecai. You realize she put her whole life in trusting his counsel. Sometimes I'll hear in our culture today, somebody will say about a father and a mother, and they'll say, well, that daughter or that son, well, they're out on their own. They can do what they want to do. They're on their own. Yeah, and you can be a fool. If you have a loving father and a mother, and let's all grandparents in here as well, we ought to teach our children to value the counsel of their elders, especially those who love the Lord and desire that the very best for their children. At Hillsdale, I can't imagine that there's one father or mother that does not want the very best for their children. But when you're young, you don't necessarily know what the best is. But your mom and dad, they could say, "Been there, done that. We've gone down that road. We've have a lifetime of things that we've learned." And I'll give you a chance to comment in just a moment. Let me wrap up here tonight. Mordecai's role and influence in Esther's life, then, I would suggest cannot be overestimated. And then one other thought I would add to that. You'll notice the last verses of the book of Esther focus primarily not on Esther, but they focus on Mordecai. And I wanted to share with you, if you can, and I know there's questions, so I'm going to give you a moment. Can I move on? All right, let's look at this. Esther 10 and verse 1. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute or a tax upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. Now, I'm not sure what the taxes were about, but I will remind you that Ahasuerus is reigning and ruling over an empire that is starting to fail. Remember, he's already lost a battle to Greece. Greece destroyed his navy. And so I don't know the purpose of the taxes. It doesn't matter. But he still is king of the great empire of the world. Esther 10 and verse 2, and all the acts of the power, his might, that is the king, the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? I don't know if that has been found yet. I know there's a lot of archaeology. There's a lot of things that have been discovered over in that area. And I wonder if the name Mordecai has ever been, archaeologically dug up. It's one of the things that I wish I would have time to start researching. Let me go to verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, so his right-hand man, the prime minister. And here's the testimony of Mordecai, great among the Jews, accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. 4 wonderful epitaphs on Mordecai's life. And I would suggest to you that Mordecai was everything that Haman was not. Haman was proud. Haman was self-centered. Haman was interested in self-promotion. But Mordecai is exactly the opposite. He ended up in the places of authority and power, not because he sought them, but because God honored him. And he was so honored that he was in a position to protect the very people that Haman desired to absolutely destroy. Our God can move on the hearts of men and to bring about that which is good. And we should trust him. On your outline, by the way, there are... in Iran, the tomb of Esther and Mordecai is there. And you could do a little research on that, but that is a holy place that is still recognized today as the burial site of Esther and Mordecai. On your outline, let me wrap up. I know I've been talking and you've been listening. What things made Mordecai a great man and one to be beloved and esteemed? How about somebody give me ideas? What are some things? Megan? Yeah. The overriding characteristic of his life is integrity, right? Even Mordecai the Jew, which you understand was a slur, really, right? It was a slur against him. But wow, God honored his faithfulness. Somebody else? Yeah, Will?
Mordecai flew in the face of all the accusations that Haman had presented to the king.
Yep.
That the Jews were.
Yep. Well, one thing I've learned, I meant to say this to you in the beginning. One of the things I've learned in studying really through this whole year is that politicians and politics has not changed. Everything that we've read about in the story of Esther is a drama that unfolds in our world constantly. And so one of the things I've learned in watching others is that usually what they are accusing you of, they are guilty of themselves. Have you noticed that? Usually when people are hurling accusations at you, they are the ones guilty of the very accusation that they're hurling. Now, there no doubt are exceptions to that, but I agree, everything that Haman was accusing Mordecai of being, Haman was the one. And it just reminded me of modern politicians. It It really does. If you stop and you dwell on it a little bit and you think, wow, there's a lot of truth in that. So here's something I would say to you. Anytime somebody is gossiping or slandering somebody else, let a red flag go up in your mind that they're probably, the one talking is probably guilty of the very things that they're saying about the other person. Somebody else. Anything else, Mordecai? Yeah.
Lord gave him that grace to be so brave and not bow down to any idol and only the one true God.
Right, right. His Mordecai's conviction that I will not bow to another, I will bow only to the Lord, was the overriding character of his life. By the way, why don't we bow to our presidents? Or the reason we don't even bow to foreign kings, unless you're Obama, and then you bow to the Shah of this and that, which he did. Just go and look. But we as Americans, we bow to no head of state. We, by conviction, believers, bow only to the Lord. That should be our passion. And sadly, we've seen it compromised again and again. But, we worship no man, right? Anybody else? Let me give you another. Here's the last thing, and I'm going to close. The Jews review the story of Esther every year when they observe the Feast of Purim. What are they teaching their children? Do you know? Yeah.
To remember a lot of, even like the stones with Joshua, to remind your children to
Yep.
remember God's protection, remember God's provision, remember God will raise people up to do what's right.
Right.
For Esther's willingness.
Well, Esther for such a time as this, it's a wonderful thing. I was reading somewhere, and I don't even know where it was, but just reading through, and somebody had said about the time that we're living, and they made the comment, not applying it from the Bible, about, are you aware that you're living for such a time as this? And I thought, man, that's something I've hit several weeks in a row now. And here's a secular writer that's writing for such a time as this. And then here, I'm going to close with this. We know that the Jewish households are teaching their children about the faith of Esther, the courage of Mordecai, the conviction of Mordecai. Here's a question for us. What are we teaching our children? What landmarks have we in our life that's non-negotiable? And I would urge you, so I'm going to get somebody upset here probably, but I'm going to close with this. Christmas and Easter have really been perverted. Really have been. And I think we need to get back to the core of those things that we believe. Like we believe in the virgin birth of the only begotten Son of God, Jesus Christ. We don't believe in, and I'm not going to get in trouble. So I don't know who's listening online, so I'm not going to end up with some angry emails coming to me. But you know what we don't believe in, right? I personally don't think it ought to be a part of our life, period. Because it devalues Christ, my opinion. The same thing is true about Resurrection Sunday. I try to avoid saying Easter. I try to say Resurrection Sunday because it is about the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not about a holiday that the Roman Catholics started. So